You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up on today's programme, calls to the government to do more to reduce the cost of energy, but will it be at the expense of climate targets? Germany's new climate minister pushes renewable power and immigration to tackle the gigantic task of reaching net zero by 2050. HS2 trains set to be powered using zero-carbon electricity. And how melting permafrost could be damaging critical infrastructure in the Arctic. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world right now and challenge those coming up with the solutions. Now, tackling the rising cost of energy is on everyone's mind this year during these cold winter months, and with a warning that gas and electricity prices are set to rise by as much as 50%. Well, today, Labour turned up the heat on the government, saying that a lack of proper investment in green solutions means it's failed to act to protect consumers against global price hikes. While proposing a cut to VAT on household bills, Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves said that it's poorest households that will be impacted the most.
The beneficiaries of this will be those people, the people who we know need that support more than anyone. We have had a decade of dither and delay from the Conservatives on energy policy. Now, there is indeed a global price spike for gas, but this government has left Britain uniquely exposed. They have failed to properly insulate homes or to invest in the new nuclear or renewables that we need. They have failed on gas storage, leaving us reliant on Russia and Qatar for our gas supply. They have failed to regulate the market, with 27 companies now gone bankrupt, and that has left rising prices hitting millions.
Well, let's bring in our business correspondent, Paul Kelso. Paul, the government's been accused of not protecting consumers against high energy prices. So what are their options, and could any decision they make actually have an impact on the country's net zero targets?
It may well do, but that very much depends on which rather limited list of options the Chancellor and the Prime Minister choose to proceed with to deal with what is a very, very difficult issue politically. And beyond that, the reason it's politically difficult, it's a very real issue for so many households. The upcoming price hike in energy bills is going to be such that all but the most affluent are going to notice it. Those least able to afford a rise are going to feel it very heavily indeed. The VAT cut Labour was pressing for today would save around £60 on your current bill and around £90 on the anticipated bills. The Prime Minister's already pretty much ruled that out. There's a lot of heat, though, around the issue of policy costs, so-called, which include green levies. These are the taxes. Wakes up around 12% of bills. It's technically loaded onto electricity bills at the moment. Now, the energy industry would like to see all those levies shifted into general taxation. They say it will be more progressive. That is, the richest would bear more of the burden because the richest pay more into general taxation. But at the moment, it's shared across everybody's bills. And it includes things like schemes that require energy providers to pay for new boilers, improved insulation in the homes of those, the poorest families, those in fuel poverty, and a host of other green, seen as decarbonisation measures, like paying those who have solar panels on their roofs to feed energy back into the grid. Again, there's some resistance today in the debate in the Commons as to moving those. The aim isn't necessarily to cut those levies entirely, but to shift them into general taxation. But that takes time. That would also require the Chancellor to carve out a lot of money from taxation to spend on those green issues. So it really does depend which way the government jumps. In reality, they're probably going to have to do a lot of these things at once to have any kind of major impact on what could be a rise to the average bill of around £700 a year. So the Chancellor somehow is going to have to subsidise some, and the government would prefer to subsidise consumers, those least able to pay, than the energy providers. But there really aren't many good options.
Well, let's take a look then at our data dashboard, which shows where the energy is coming from in Great Britain at the moment. And fossil fuels make up more than 50% of the power mix. That includes gas, as Paul was saying, 53.6% from gas, 2.2% there from coal. And also you can see the renewables figure as well, just over 20% coming from renewables in that power mix right now. So that's what's happening in Great Britain. But what about other parts of the world? Well, in Germany, the new climate minister said that the country faces a gigantic task if it wants to achieve its goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Renewable sources such as solar and wind power currently provide about 43% of Germany's electricity. But Robert Habeck said that share needs to almost double to 80% to achieve net zero by 2050. So let's take you live now to our Europe correspondent, Adam Parsons. So Adam, how does the government there intend to go about it then?
Well, the first thing to say is that this government is a coalition. Robert Habeck is a Green politician. He's the climate minister. And it is him saying that Germany has got to get a move on, faces this gigantic challenge of meeting its emissions targets. Now, his ideas include some of the things that Paul Kelso was just talking about there, shunting the levies from consumers onto central federal government backing, putting incentives in place for businesses to use solar panel, and also throwing an awful lot of money at wind power. He's now got to get this through, though, legislation. He's got two big tranches that he wants to put in place, and he says this is urgent. He says Germany actually increased its emissions last year, that it will miss its climate targets in 22 and 23. And Germany has a pretty steep target of reducing emissions by 65% from their 1990 target by 2030. That is an even steeper target than the European Union has set for itself. Now, what he did also say is that Germany's still going to have to lean on gas, and that is enormously controversial across Europe, because this new list of supported gas systems, the Germans say they need to have gas, the French say they want to have nuclear. Germans extremely angry about that because, of course, they are phasing out nuclear power. So that is leading to a row. The extension, there's been an extension now to the deadline for when an agreement has to be found around this approval for this new power system. The Greens are digging their feet in. This clearly is how they want to make their mark on German politics. But another interesting thing that Robert Habeck said is that the workforce that will be open to Germany is going to decline, because Germany, like so many countries, is faced with an aging population. He says that will reduce the number of people that is open. And what does he say that means? He says that means that Germany needs to expand the number of migrants that it attracts in order to boost this new economy, this new greener economy that he envisages.
Adam, thank you. HS2 trains will be powered using zero-carbon electricity. The government announced the plans as part of its pledge to reduce all greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. The first phase of HS2 from London to Birmingham is scheduled to open sometime between 2029 and 2033. Mark Thurston, the chief executive of HS2, said the government and the rail industry has the time to achieve that goal.
If we don't find a way of driving carbon out of the built environment on a project of our size and longevity, frankly, then that will be a missed opportunity for the whole sector. So very much we do a lot of work with the designers and the contractors to make sure we find every opportunity to reduce carbon out of the railway. We'll draw power from the wider national grid, of course, as part of the wider government's commitment to more renewable sources. By then, our expectation is that we'll be using zero carbon energy supplies. I mean, already in certain instances now, in certain quarters in our demand for power in the UK, we take more power from renewable sources than from carbon sources. And of course, this railway opens in the 2030s. So we've got time to work with the government and the power industry to ensure that this railway is powered by zero carbon green energy.
Some of the day's other climate news now, and one of Britain's largest energy companies has apologised after it suggested that customers could cuddle their pets and do star jumps instead of turning on the heating. OVO Energy said it was embarrassed by the blog post, which offered customers 10 tips on how to save energy and stay warm this winter. Several MPs have called the comments insulting and offensive. The Mayor of London is calling on people to reduce their car use and find greener ways of travelling around the capital. Sadiq Khan says London is facing a crisis of filthy air and gridlocked roads, as latest data reveals that car use has nearly recovered to pre-pandemic levels. Public transport is significantly lower, with buses at 70% and tube travel at just 55%. Experts surveyed by the World Economic Forum are more worried about climate change than they are about coronavirus. The WEF's annual risks report has found their three biggest concerns are insufficient climate action, extreme weather and loss of biodiversity. Until now, infectious diseases had been top of the list. And I'll be asking economist Vicky Price and the Nature Conservancy's International Climate Policy Director, John Verdiek, whether they agree with the experts in tonight's discussion, and that's in just a few minutes' time. Now, if you look at the Earth from space, large areas are covered in ice. Now, that's permafrost, large land masses that are completely frozen. But the permafrost is melting, and according to a new report, that's damaging up to half of the Arctic's infrastructure. Here's why.
A lot of it is relatively wet conditions, right? You can think about kind of wetlands up north, and a lot of that carbon is released as methane, much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. There are direct impacts that are already seen by people, industries, by indigenous communities that live on permafrost today.
Do stay tuned. Coming up here on the Daily Climate Show, I'll be joined by economist Vicky Price and John Verdiek, the Director of International Climate Policy at the Nature Conservancy in the US. And we're going to be discussing if climate change is high enough on the UK's list of priorities. And as ketchup sachets could be prohibited in the near future, we ask what else could Britain benefit from banning? Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Now we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day now with economist Vicky Price and John Verdiek, the Director of International Climate Policy at the Nature Conservancy in the US. So a very good evening to both of you. Nice to see you both. So, first of all, climate change is the biggest risk now facing humanity, the main finding from a survey of global experts by the World Economic Forum. In a world still struggling with the coronavirus pandemic, that's quite a statement. So, Vicky, what do you make of it? Respondents putting the climate change issue front and centre stage. Is that surprising given the unprecedented number of deaths and economic crises we've seen as a result of the pandemic, which we're still dealing with?
It's not terribly surprising, I have to say, because, of course, they've been asked to see and think what the situation might be over the next few years. And what they have, of course, experienced is that the threat of the pandemic has been reduced. And remember that quite a lot of people who've been answering these questions have been from Europe. So we've seen, of course, the Omicron variant affect us, but overall the impact of these new waves is less. So they can see growth happening. They've seen growth, in fact, overall during 2021, and there's likely to be growth again in the economy 2022. So they can now shift the attention to other issues. And of course, we had COP26. It will be very odd if they hadn't put the environmental issues quite high up. But when you look at the report, though, and you look at the details of some of the concerns that they have, there is no doubt they're still worried about the way in which growth is happening, the fact that there is a lot of inequality around the technological changes taking place, and particularly they're concerned about the way in which dealing with climate change and environmental issues, if it's done wrongly, might actually lead to even more societal discord and issues coming up when people will find themselves either excluded or having to pay a very big price for this transition, and therefore might, if anything, resent what the politicians perhaps would be trying to do, or even businesses may be trying to do.
Yeah, John, what do you make of it? Are you surprised that climate is so clearly at the top of the list of concerns rather than the pandemic? And do these surveys make any difference? Do they pay attention to them in the US, for example? Could it have an impact on policy?
Yeah, I totally agree with Vicky. I don't think it's surprising. I think it's telling, though. I think the success of COP26 coming out and just showing how much more the world is paying attention to this is starting to come out in these communiques from the WEF, from all these different groups. And, you know, I think we're going to keep seeing it more and more, especially with the fact that climate change, we're seeing storms becoming more severe, becoming more frequent. When we start to look forward into the future, and as Vicky was talking about some of the GDP numbers and economic forecasts going forward, we're going to see that start to make greater and greater impacts across the board and around the world.
And John, on the point of whether or not it could change policy, these kind of surveys, did they influence politicians?
Absolutely. You know, I think on the other hand, anything that happens locally tends to influence politicians more than anything that happens globally, which is why we do see a bit of this tragedy of the commons with climate change. As the United States, you know, whether it's going to be a congressperson or the president, starts to see more of this happen, we're going to see more action. Now, we have seen in the United States, there's a Build Back Better bill that's been in Congress for quite a while, and we're disappointed to see that it hasn't gone through yet. But we're also enlightened to see the fact that it's still on the table, and we're hopeful.
And Vicky, what about the UK? Because UK experts were much more worried about the failure of cyber security than climate change. I mean, what does that tell us about the UK's approach, do you think?
I don't think it means that businesses are not interested, or the experts are not really interested or worried about the climate change issues. It means that there are some pressing problems that need to be dealt with. And I think the worry is that they're not addressed, certainly not by politicians or by regulation. And the reason for it, I think, if you look at the list of countries that have been most affected by cyber attacks, I mean, yes, we hear quite a lot of sort of political cyber attacks that take place in various parts of the world. But in reality, in terms of businesses and the way in which they've been affected, it seems to be mostly in the US and number 2 in the UK. So again, it's something that businesses will be facing increasingly. And if you perhaps focus too much on, let's say, just climate change, or maybe another issue, which is, of course, could be quite important right now, you could miss the fact that being able to operate in the world economy the way that quite a lot of the businesses need to do also means that they should be free from those cyber attacks, or at least they should be able to find some way of protecting themselves against it. And I think that's what's coming up, I think, in the survey.
OK, let's talk about our next topic now, shall we? Because the Environment Secretary, George Eustice, could add ketchup sachets and mini milk cartons to a plastics ban list, according to a story that featured in the Sun newspaper today. Now, the list has already seen the demise of plastic straws and stirrers, but are ketchup sachets really the obvious contender for a ban, or is it simply a petty little project as described by one think tank? Vicky, what do you think? Should we ban tomato ketchup sachets, or should the government be focusing on bigger issues when it comes to the environment?
I think we could focus on bigger issues, but you can also do little things that might make a difference. In my view, going down this route isn't going to really suddenly, change the climate change projections that we've got. But of course, every little bit helps. But if we do this here in the UK, or another little thing that makes people feel happier, perhaps that something is being done at a micro level, the real question is this a global attempt? I mean, is this part of the general effort against plastics, for example, that we've seen happen, across the world? If it is and it fits with it, then okay, that's fine, as long as we give enough warning and the producers can have something else instead that they can supply us with in order that we can enjoy our whatever it is, our McDonald's, without our kids screaming too much.
John, do you agree with that? Do you think that government should ban things like this, or should it be up to consumers to be grown up and make the decisions for themselves? I mean, how would a ban like this go down in the States, for example, do you think?
Yeah, in the States, it would be mostly at a more local or a state level that this kind of implementation could happen. And we've seen it with grocery bags and things like that of other single-use plastics. And, we're supportive of taking action with single-use plastics and reducing it. It spurs innovation to find other things that we could do. It also makes those of us that are individual consumers start to think about our own behavior. And as all of us start to spread or push our own behavior in better directions, we're going to see a better outcome. And, it's also one of the things, as we look at ketchup, we start to also think about burgers and the things that we use with them. And how do we make burgers more sustainable is probably the next push on this. And how do we try to make global emissions go down, perhaps in the Amazon rainforest, by making more sustainable supply chains of the burger to pair up with that ketchup movement?
Well, yes, so Vicky, does it matter which products are particularly targeted? I've seen some commentators calling this petty regulation. Others are even suggesting there's some snobbery to the types of products that are being targeted. These are sachets often seen in fast food outlets, for example. Does it matter which products are targeted?
Well, yes, I think it needs to be seen that it's not necessarily sort of discriminating against particular parts of the economy. And I think this is a question that needs to be addressed in all sorts of areas. For example, if I can digress a second and talk about
Briefly,
electric vehicles, for example. Yes, and we're pushing those quite hard, but in reality, quite a lot of people cannot afford them. They don't have the charging points. And there is a feeling that perhaps what we're doing is we're making it much harder for those at the lower end of the pay bracket and making it easier for those higher up.
John, a quick word on what you'd like to see banned.
Yeah, I think more, rather than ban, I think we need more information. Consumers tend to make really good choices. And just to go back to where I just mentioned, thinking about if we're getting beef, we want to make sure that if it's coming from the Amazon, that we have reliable data that says that this is not from an area that was previously pristine rainforest. It was something that was used on marginalized land that's already in existence. And that consumers can then make the choice and make sure that what's on their dinner table or what they're buying from a restaurant is actually good for the planet.
OK, well, John Burdick and Vicky Price, really interesting to talk to you tonight. Thanks very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Well, tomorrow I'll be joined by Shi Hu, Honorary Fellow at Oxford's Environmental Change Institute, and Richard Black, Senior Associate at the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.